Hello, brothers and sisters. I just hope that you're doing fine wherever you are today. Now, just a quick question that I want to ask you, and I want you to ponder around this. Why do you think that it was so hard for white people to leave black folks alone, even if they understood that it is not right to treat black people the same way? Let me keep it a little bit simple. Why do you think it was so hard for white people to let black people be without working for them? Because they noticed that there's a secret when you have a person that works for you and you don't pay them anything. They work for you for free and they make you a lot of money, they make you a lot of wealth. Me addressing this as a black person doesn't make me feel good about it, but I'm trying to make you understand the significance. I want you to understand the magnitude of how black people have created wealth for these people. And now it's not even just about that. We are going to address the issue of black tax. When I say black tax, I'm not talking about the family black tax, but I'm talking about the cost of being a black person in America, the problems that this comes with. Being a person in America has really a lot of things to play with. There is a lot of wealth that black people have created that is unaccountable for, and even the history itself will not let you know this. But I'm happy, and it makes me happy see the professors like Sean Rochester talk about this, and it's really important. Talking about the question of black tax and the cost of being a black person in the United States, looking deep down into historic issues, systemic issues that are happening in the United States. And now, I don't want to say much because a lot of you hate when I talk too much, right? So I'm going to just let you watch the video and then I'll be back. We'll have a discussion about this. I hope you find this video so informational, so informative. If you're watching this video for the first time, I'll most definitely ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership, and really get to see what we can offer you. Until then, watch the video. I'll be back and we'll talk about it, and let's meet and talk about it. Also, tell me what you feel about this video. Around in the comment section. I'll be happy to engage with you. Until then, let's dive right into it.
But what we're going to do is look at things from an economic perspective, right? One of the first things I want you to understand is that slavery, by definition, is a 100% tax on your labor. It means that nothing that you produce is yours. You are not even yours. Now, there's many things that we could never price or value from that time. You could never price or value what it is to be a woman and to never have control over your body over the entirety of your life. You could never price what it is to be a man and to be unable to protect your spouse or your daughter or your mother, so on and so forth, or to ever be able to reap the fruits of your labor. But one of the things that you can value is the cost of the labor extracted from those people over 250 years, about a quarter of a millennia, millions of people. And economists have tried to do that. Some put the number at up to 24 trillion. Others put it as high as 97 trillion. Let's say that the truth is somewhere in the middle. We could be talking about as high as $50 trillion, right? It's a massive number. It's an extraordinary number. And even if you've never seen that number before, you're taking time to digest it, that's not the only thing that we can price from that period. Because if we kind of fast forward to 1860, you've got 4 million people in bondage. They are the most liquid asset in the country. They represent 50% of all value in the South. And if you're old, there's a price. And if you're young, there's a price. And if you're able-bodied, there's a price. And if you're not, there's a price. And if you're male or female, there's a price. And people were traded on open markets. So if you look at what is the value of those folks, it turns out that the value is so large that economists say you have to measure it in terms of GDP, national income, or net wealth. That's how large it is. So if you look at it from a net wealth standpoint, we're talking about 15.5 trillion. Now you say to yourself, Sean, how you come up with 15.5 trillion? right? So national wealth is roughly $85 trillion for the United States. Economists put the value of Black people held in bondage between 16 and 20% of national wealth. If you put it on an equivalent basis of what it would be today. So 16 to 20% is about 14 to 17 trillion dollars of today's equivalent. So you can average of those, you're at 15.5. If you measured it from a GDP standpoint, national income, they say it's between 1 and 2 years of national income, right? So if you looked at that, it's about 28.5 trillion. How do you come up with that number? Well, national income is about 19 trillion a year. So you're talking about between 19 and 38 trillion. If you take an average between the two, you're at 28.5. So if you value it from a net income standpoint, you're close to 16. If you look at it from a net income standpoint, you're close to 29. If you look at it from a wealth standpoint, it's almost 16. If you took an average of those two things, which we do when we're making valuations, you're talking about $22 trillion in today's equivalent. The point here is that no matter how you look at this, you're talking about massive, hard to conceive numbers in size and scope. So let's talk a little bit about the economic implication of that, right? So if you look at the 45 million African Americans today, their net worth in total is about $1.5 trillion. About 1.5. So we just established that if you value those 4 million slaves in 1860 in today's equivalent, we're talking about 22 trillion. So what does that imply? It implies that 4 million slaves 152 years ago was worth 15 times more to the country than 45 million African Americans today. Those are the numbers and the fact pattern. So in terms of slavery, we could say up to $50 trillion. Now you can say, listen, I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was that bad. However, while it was a tragic period, it did come to an end, right? And it came to an end a long time ago. And there's been plenty of time since then to accumulate resources, right? So, you can't pin it all on that period. You could say, yeah, I hear what you're saying. Let's talk about that a little bit, right? Because what we have to remember is that people were emancipated. They left bondage with no capital, no resources. In 1870, African Americans owned about 0.17% of US wealth. It's effectively nothing, right? Now, there was some talk about providing land, right? And a mule. That's the 40 acres and a mule. We all heard about that, right? That, of course, never happened. There is something that did happen that's called the Homestead Act. And we're going to kind of look at those two things real quick and kind of talk about the implication of it. So if you think about 40 acres and a mule, a great question to ask is, well, what would that be worth today? Right? So you got 4 million people in bondage. You're talking about 40 acres and a mule. Quick math puts that at 160 million acres, right? It's really hard to conceive what that is. I once looked at some land with a group of friends, about 400 acres. 400 acres, you need to go up in a helicopter. 160 million, hard to conceive, right? If you think about what would that be worth today, well, like the average price of an acre is, it's between $3,000, $20, and it can go as high as $6,350, which means on a high end, that's about $1 trillion. It's what that would be worth in today's equivalent. And it'll be generating about $90 billion a year. You can check all these numbers, right? So substantial. On the one hand, it's substantial, right? On the other hand, it's only about 2% of what was actually extracted from those people and their forefathers. And not even 2% as startup resources was allowed to happen. But there is something that actually did happen, right? In 1862, Congress passed this law, the Homestead Act. And because of this law, they would proceed to distribute about 246 million acres to 1.5 million white families, right? So if you looked at that from the same kind of valuation methodology, you're talking about $1.6 trillion in total, or the equivalent of about $1 million a family on the high end. Now listen, I'm all about hard work and bootstraps, but $1 million, them a hella bootstraps, right? So how did it work? The way it worked was this. People had the opportunity to claim, maybe up to 160 acres. And if you were able to claim it and you stayed on it for 5 years, that's the stead part of the homestead, right? Then you could take possession of it after the 5 years. Now, here's something else to note. So that means, you could be an immigrant coming from another country. You have a chance to claim this land. And if you did, you took possession of it after 5 years. But the other thing that happened after 5 years is you could naturalize as a citizen. That's about how long it took. So you could come here literally with nothing but the shirt on your back. And in 5 years, be in an extraordinary financial position. Now, researchers say that there are about up to 93 million white Americans are direct beneficiaries of this. Direct beneficiaries, not tertiary, not secondary, not kind of, sort of, some way related, direct of a massive, government giveaway, right? So in terms of the potential of land that would have been distributed, you're talking about on the high end, about $1 trillion that was denied, right? But at the same time, $1.6 trillion worth of value was distributed. Important to know. So if we fast forward a couple of years from 1860, we get to the point where you have the Civil War is happening and then has happened. And the context is this, the Southern economy is devastated, right? The global cotton market is devastated. The land confiscated in the Civil War from the South by the North is given back to them. And they have a massive demand for cheap, abundant labor. I'm going to pause there because I just fast forward through like a lot of really important stuff, right? But I'm going to just highlight a couple really key things for you to understand. So the global cotton market is a big deal. It's the first global industry. It's the equivalent of oil today, right? Slaves in the South, in bondage, people produced that cotton. That cotton represented 61% of exports from the US. And it was 80% of the global cotton market. You just can't beat free labor. There are about 20 million people around the world employed in that industry in some way or form. About 1 million of those lose their jobs with the Civil War and the emancipation of these people. It's a big deal. It affects India and Egypt and Russia and Japan and Europe and all kinds of different places. And the world's crying out like, what is America going to do to put her newly freed people back to work? It's a huge issue. And the solution for that is this thing called Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow is an amazingly nondescript name for something. It's kind of like the Sean Rochester period. Dun, dun, dun. Right? So what is the Jim Crow period? The Jim Crow is basically a system of laws and customs that are reinforced with an extraordinary level of violence to impose a 100% tax on a sharecropper's labor. I know what you're thinking. Sean, you sound a little hyperbolic. 100% tax on these people's labor. I know they were poor, but they had something. I'm like, listen, I hear you. I hear you. I'll let you decide if it's 100% tax, right? We'll keep going. So what's sharecropping and how does it work? Basically, those large, mega plantations were broken into smaller lots. Black families would then settle on those lots. They would agree to plant and cultivate cash crops. At the end of the season, they would bring those crops to market, and then they would share in a portion of the crops, right? So sharecropping. Here's a challenge. It was an actual contract, the terms and conditions of which were set by the small white farmer. Something that's very important to remember is that these people have effectively no wealth, and that the crop does not come tomorrow. The crop comes at the end of the season or at the end of the year. And between now and then, that white farmer has got to provide you with the seeds and the tools and the fertilizer and your clothes and your food and your housing, everything for that entire year at rates as high as 70% per annum. And in some cases, if you fell ill and could not do your work, they could outsource it to someone else and then charge it to you. So effectively, what is happening there is that white farmer sets your cost structure or your expenses, right? Now, at the end of the season, when you bring the crops to market, what you need to understand is the small white farmer is the market. He tells you what your crops are worth, which means that he sets your revenue or your income. And if someone controls your revenue and they control your expenses, by definition, that means they control your profit. I think you see where I'm going with this 100% tax, right? Now, if you are fortunate, your profit will be zero. If you are unfortunate because they don't want you to go to someone else who's more generous, then your profit will be negative, which means you owe them. And they will roll that into what you owe them for the next year. And that leads to perpetual debt servitude. Now, I am very well aware of what you're thinking right now. And what you're thinking right now is, Sean, that's a bad deal. I'm not going to take that deal. You like apples? How you like them apples? And I'm with you on that. It's a bad deal. But here's the problem if you don't take that deal. They got a law for that. And those laws say that if you cannot prove that you are a landowner and you cannot prove that you are gainfully employed, you will be charged with a criminal offense and put in a state or county jail. Now you're going to be like, all right, well, I didn't know that part. So I'll sign a contract. But you know what? I'm just not going to do the work. The problem with that is that they got a law for that. And those laws are called contract enforcement laws because you signed an employment contract. And if you break that, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail. Now, some of you might be thinking, look, I didn't realize that either, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to sit in jail. They're going to feed me 3 square meals a day. And when they get tired of that, they can let me out because I'm not doing it because it's a bad deal. And they got something for that. And that's called convict leasing, which means that they will lease you back to the very same small white farmer that you did not want to work for or to a private corporation. And if you take that deal, there's one thing I want you to understand. There is one aspect of convict leasing that you could argue is even worse than slavery, just this one, which is that while a slave owner will kill you and will beat you within an inch of your life, they would prefer to have you around for another 10 or 15 or 20 years to maximize their return on their investment. They have what's known as an interest in your residual value, right? Under convict leasing, there is no such interest. I care not about you 10 years from now. I care about you only for the terms which you are working for me. 6 months, 8 months, 18 months, 24 months. That is it. And under those conditions, you have mortality rates that are approaching 50%, which means you have a 1 in 2 chance of death associated with that. The other thing you have to realize is, as horrible as it sounds, it's incredibly profitable. You're a small white farmer, you can afford a whole slave. Slaves are expensive. You could rent one at a fraction of the cost. Treat them however you want it. It's incredibly lucrative. In 1914, the state of Alabama, 20% of their revenues were coming from convict leasing alone. And what's interesting about this is this isn't a bad 3 or 5 year period. This isn't a bad decade that we went through. This thing lasted for 75 years. And over the course of that time, 4,000 Black people were lynched. This is that we know of, right? That's publicly executed by your fellow American. It is the equivalent of one Black person being executed per week for 75 years. Under those conditions, you will get the hint. Your family will get the hint. Your community will get the hint. Nobody's been prosecuted for these things. So I think you see where the 100% tax on the labor is coming from. And if it is 100% tax on the labor, that means that by definition, it is slavery, which is why they call it slavery by another name. Now, if during the period of actual legal bondage, 50 trillion was extracted for those folks, and now they extended that another 75 years, which is about a third of the time, you can argue that another 15 trillion was extracted from these people. And what you have to remember is that while there were 4 million Black people in the fields in 1860, 1935, you still had 4 million Black people in the fields, value being extracted under these conditions. So let's think about the implication of that. That means that upon emancipation, the white slaveholding power structure lost $22 trillion, equivalent to today's dollars, gone. But then over the next 75 years, they would proceed to claw back 15 trillion from the descendants of these newly freed people. How does one accumulate wealth under these circumstances? Jim Crow period. So now you can say, listen, wow, that was significant. And that's, I didn't know that, right? What I do know is that, you know what, not everybody was under Jim Crow. Some people got an education. W.E.B. Du Bois went to Harvard, right? So some people got an education. So let's talk about education. And I would say, yeah, you're right. Education is the great equalizer. We call it in today's parlance, human capital development, snazzy name, right? Associated with that. But here's the problem, is that upon emancipation, the white planter class was interested in cheap, abundant labor. They were not interested in public education. Now, small white farmers were absolutely interested in the creation and expansion of public education for their children, as they should be. Newly free people were absolutely interested in the creation and expansion of public education for themselves and their children, as they should be. White planters, not so much. They educated their children privately. But what they did need was the support of the small white farmer. So they agreed to expand public education, but that they would divert resources from Black children to white children. So W.E.B. Du Bois says that in the 40 years since emancipation, Negro taxes and the Negro share of income from indirect taxes and endowments have fully repaid white investment in the Negro's education. That's how little on net was invested, right? In 1914, a gentleman by the name of William H. Baldwin, who was the president of something called the General Education Board, you can think of that as the Department of Education at the federal level. He said the South needed Negroes educated so they could be the best possible laborers, and that with the right kind of education, Negroes will willingly work menial jobs and this will open up opportunities for Southern whites to work more expert labor. This is a person who's responsible for education, right? For the descendants of newly free people. By 1917, there are about 64 public high schools across the entire South. Not in a county, not in a state, the South, right? Not a whole lot of investment in human capital development. Most of the schools in the K through 12 system are built and owned by Black people. So it's a form of double taxation. Now, if you, in New York City in 1920, they are investing per child about 50 times more than a Black child is receiving in South Carolina under segregation. 50 times more. What I want you to understand about that, and at the time, New York City is about 97 point something percent white. It's not nearly as diverse as you conceive it now. What that means is that you could come from another country um, to this country, by Ellis Island. And if you stayed in New York, while you came with no resources, you were going into a system that was investing 50 times more in you and your children, their human capital development, than a Black child was getting in South Carolina, whose parents had been here and people before him had been here for hundreds of years, right? Just a massive difference. In the South, for every dollar invested in a Black child, you have 5 to 8 invested to educate a white child. Not rocket science. If you do that with your children, one's going to be a pauper, one's going to Harvard, right? Black teachers in the South are being paid 25 to 34% on the dollar of what white teachers are being paid. Tough to accumulate wealth under those situations. White students are receiving 50% more years of education by the time they're 25. Massive differential in investment in human capital. It is so substantial that researchers say, listen, if you had just invested in the children the same, just keep all the discrimination and stuff in the marketplace, just invested in the children the same, that could have cut the income gap by up to 50%. Just doing that, just doing what the law actually said. So when you start talking about this happening across millions of children for up to 90 years, in a generation, you're talking about over $600 billion of financial impact. And across that period of time, you're talking about up to $3 trillion. So there is a cost to discrimination. Now you can say, listen, I hear you. However, back in the day, you didn't really need an education. We all have a story about a grandfather or a great grandfather in our family that had a fifth grade level education, a terrific work ethic, got a home, raised the family, did well. We all have experiences like that. So you didn't really need an education. So all you needed was really hard work and purchasing of a home. And you could have done really well. What happened there? And I think that's a really great point. And we could talk a little bit about that, because housing is the great wealth builder. It absolutely is, for everyone in particular, and for African Americans, for everyone in general, for African Americans in particular, right? Because about 64% of the net worth of the typical African American family is associated with real estate. It's critically important. It's actually really important to the country. The American dream is home ownership. The government invested heavily in helping Americans achieve that dream. I think that's a wonderful and terrific and noble thing. It is a massive reason why you have such a large middle class. They invested about $120 billion. Back in the day, it's the equivalent of about $1 trillion today. Here's the problem. Less than 2%, and substantially less than 2% of any of those resources invested went to any Black family. Right? So I'm sure you guys have heard about, FHA and redlining, right? I won't go into a lot of detail about that. But the federal government invented the mortgage as we know it, right? And what they did was they just guaranteed the payments. That lowered the risk and allowed banks to take lower deposits and to spread out the payment over up to 30 years, right? It allowed millions of people to purchase a home that they could otherwise never afford, right? Only problem is that they refused to guarantee loans for African Americans, and absolutely for African Americans who wanted to live in white communities. They were afraid of what they called neighborhood stability. Now you can say, well, I'll just talk to the bank directly. The bank also refused, or the banks also refuse to lend to African Americans. You can say, well, I'll talk to the builder. We'll work it out. Builders also refused. And the banks and the builders had another problem, which is that the federal government wouldn't guarantee their loans if they didn't refuse. And then you can say, I'm going to talk to the realtor. We'll work it out. They'll help me find something. Unfortunately, realtors, real estate agents refuse to participate in these transactions. And you can say, listen, we'll just talk to our fellow American. We'll work it out, right? Person to person. And unfortunately, residents sign covenants amongst themselves that said if you ever sell from this community, that you will sell to a person who is Caucasian or of European descent. So you've got a complete phalanx, right? Now you can say, look, that sounds super duper qualitative. And I would say, you're right. The data's in the book. But what I can say quite definitively is that less than 1% of all mortgages issued in the United States of America between 1930 and 1960 went to Black people. There's no greater wealth builder. There's nothing more important than less than 1%. Now you can say, look, I get it. And one thing to think about is if you can't get a mortgage, it doesn't mean that you don't want a home. You still want the American dream. So what people started to do was they turned to the private markets under something called contract sales. And private markets are unregulated. So what happens in these markets is you don't have to do appraisals. So homes are being sold at like 2x the value. On top of that, there's astronomical interest rates. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that you don't build equity in the house as you make your payments. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. Let's say we make an agreement that I'm going to purchase the home from you and that I'm going to make 100 installment payments before I take ownership of it, right? And I make 99 of those payments and I miss the 100. What it allows you to do is to keep all 99 payments, to keep my down payment, to take back the house, to evict me, and to resell the house to someone else. You earn no equity in the house, and you are responsible for the upkeep and maintenance of those homes by that contract. How do people accumulate wealth under these circumstances? Now, you can say, look, it's a terrible period. You can buckle down and just, work your best and save your money, right? In the place where you're renting and kind of wait for some of this craziness to blow over. You know what I mean? But here's the problem with that. We're talking about a time at which you have many millions of people fleeing the South and being forced into these corralled areas that they call urban ghettos. Ghetto means involuntary, by the way, connotation. What happens when the demand for space is going up and the amount of space is not going up? The price of the space goes up, right? So it turns out that in those impoverished urban ghetto communities, the rent is more than 50% higher than outside of those communities. You can't even save money in there. How does one accumulate wealth under these circumstances? And if you say, look, just work hard, economists have looked at labor market.
Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the channel. Now, the first thing that I believe that I need to start with is trying to describe how Rochester sees black tax, because his definition of black tax is not the same as what usually we know. But his definition of black tax, this is he defines black tax as the financial cost Black Americans bear due to historic and systemic discrimination, which includes denied opportunities for wealth creation, to disparities in discrimination, lending, and higher costs of goods and services. 3 is emotional and psychological costs tied to these disadvantages. Now, something important that I'd like to address first, we need to know, for those people who still don't know, who is Mr. Sean Rochester. Sean Rochester is an expert, an entrepreneur, and an author of best known for his books, The Black Tax and the Cost of Being Black in the United States, in America. Now, I found this video so intriguing as a black person watches this video, because it really shares a message to some Caucasians who think that it's advantageous that black people are always complaining, but just now, just seeing the opportunities that could have been made if black people had the same opportunities as they had. Because the video first tries to make you understand where black people loses their resources. One, in form of taxes. Two, this video demystifies the significance or the magnitude of the work that black people put. Three, this video also proves and shows you how much wealth black people have lost. One, through promises that didn't happen. Like, for example, he talked about Homestead Act. He talked about 40 acres and a mule that was promised to black people, but it didn't happen, right? So just coming out and addressing these issues, it's usually an important aspect of black history, because in as much as a person will come and complain to you that, oh, you black folks, you keep on complaining about this and this, but the systemic issues that are there that these people are benefiting in, they're not trying to see them, but they are always trying to see you as a person who is complaining about these issues. And I feel like it's important that now we have a platform that we can have one-on-one discussions about this, because there's so many, there's a deep research that the professor has done, that professor has put into place for us, for you and I to understand. And I've learned a lot. I've learned so much just by watching the video. I mean, it's not like it's rocket science to know this, but at least the way he has explained to it has made the point reach home. And now I understand why there's a huge disparities between black people and white people. True that, because history itself tries to explain to you this. And in as matter of fact, if a person didn't come with a presentation like this, it would be unbelievable. And we also have black professors who have come out and talked about these. And so yeah, it's important for us to always have these uncomfortable talks, because truly it shows where race started beating black people, like economically. And so I pray that whenever you're watching this video, you're taking points and you're understanding why it is so hard for white people and black people to compete like economically. You understand that white people had the leverage. And just a question, you ask yourself, what was the leverage? The leverage is they had an opportunity of working or starting earlier as compared to black folks, because black folks worked for them. They didn't have something for them. They were denied all these, right? And when they were denied all these, this means that they kept working for these same people who denied them. The same opportunities that they had. So it really makes sense that we need to have these talks, right? I would love to know. Tell me what you think about this in the comment section. This is the presenter Ginger Stories. I didn't have a lot to say about this because honestly, I was also learning in the video while I was watching it with you, right? Feel free to let me know what you think about this in the comment section. Until then, let's meet in my next video. If you're watching this video for the first time, most definitely I'll ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership, really get to see what we can offer you. Until then, peace, love, and harmony.